And remind everyone that, see, I thought that was.
Recording in progress.
Remind everyone that you can participate with this meeting in multiple ways. There's the call-in information at the bottom of the screen if you're watching it via Legistar. And also on the agenda, the Zoom and also the phone call in is there. Please stand for the flag salute. So can we get Tripp, can we get commissioners present, please?
Ivor Scovdell. Noah Levy.
Here.
Thomas Mulder.
Here.
Peggy O'Neill.
Here.
Sarah West.
Here.
Jerome Kirazi. And Lorna McFarland.
Here.
Are there any agenda modifications?
We have no modifications to the agenda tonight.
Okay, thank you. So next would be D, public comment on non-agenda items. I'll start with those of you in the room. So if anyone wants to comment on non-agenda items, please come to the podium. Seeing no one approach the podium for non-agenda items, we'll go to Zoom. Please raise your hand, *9, I believe it is, if you want to comment on non-agenda items. Not seeing anyone with their hand up there, so we'll move on to item E, public workshop on draft tiny house village and emergency housing village ordinance. Turn it over to staff. Director, my staff's pulling that up. Just wanted a point of clarification. It was my understanding as a workshop, and I just want to be corrected if I'm wrong. The staff would do a presentation. There'd be any clarifying questions from the commission, then we take public comment and then go from there. Is that correct?
I think that would be an appropriate procedure to follow, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, good evening, commissioners and members of the public. My name is Megan Acevedo, and I'm here to present the draft Tiny House Village and Emergency Housing Village Ordinance. The draft Tiny House Village and Emergency Housing Village Ordinance has been developed in order to achieve policies and measures within the housing element of the general plan. Policy 31 and Implementation Measure 40 of the housing element states that the county shall amend the zoning regulations to allow a grouping or clustering of 3 or more tiny houses or movable tiny houses as multifamily dwellings, and shall be permitted by right in all zones that allow multifamily dwellings. Section 314-62.3 of the draft ordinance allows for tiny house villages containing 3 to 20 units per acre. Implementation Measure 40 also states that a grouping or clustering of 3 or more detached bedrooms with central sanitary, laundry, cooking, and dining facilities shall also constitute a tiny house village and shall be permitted by right in all zones that allow multifamily dwellings. Section 314-62.4.1, under the Emergency Housing Villages section, allows for 3 to 20 detached units called dependent units with common areas for kitchen and bathroom facilities. A density of 20 units per acre was decided on for both a tiny house village and a dependent unit village. And that is because it is in line with other tiny house village models and allows for a density that is in line with the residential low density and residential medium density. Implementation Measure 58 of the housing element states that the county shall amend the zoning regulations to include provisions for alternative lodge park as an enumerated use subject to a use permit. An alternative lodge park would provide spaces for temporary or permanent occupancy that are flexible, allowing a broad range of housing types. The range of allowable dwelling types include manufactured and mobile homes, recreational vehicles, travel trailers, tiny houses, movable tiny houses, and temporary camping facilities. Temporary camping facilities here are to be defined as tents and membrane structures. The maximum units per acre for any alternative lodge park will be determined by the Planning Commission based on site conditions. The draft ordinance has 2 main sections, the Tiny House Village section and the Emergency Housing Village section. Tiny house villages are required to meet the standards of California residential building codes for dwelling units. In order to allow for a separate and less intensive building permit process, the Emergency Housing Village section was developed, which requires consistency with Section 8698 of Government Code and is allowable under the local declaration of a shelter crisis. This allows for the use of emergency housing building standards in California Residential Code, Appendix X. This allows for dependent units with common use facilities and for alternative lodge parks. The draft ordinance allows for tiny house villages to be principally permitted in multifamily residential zones, unclassified zones with a land use designation of residential medium density or residential low density, and in mixed-use urban zones that have connection to water and sewer. A special permit would be required for any tiny house villages on multifamily residential or mixed-use urban zones without connection to water and sewer, and will be required to meet the Department of Environmental Health standards. Tiny house villages will require a conditional use permit in mixed-use rural, community commercial, highway service commercial, and residential suburban and residential 2-family zones at a density no greater than allowed. This is 7 to 30 units per acre for residential medium density and 1 to 8 units per acre for residential low density. Development standards that have been included in the draft ordinance for tiny house villages are connection to water and sewer, or Department of Environmental Health approved on-site water and sewer, available connection to grid power, access from a Category 4 road and a Category 2 driveway, an assigned address for each unit, 1 on-site parking space per unit, an on-site designated solid waste area, shall meet the applicable setbacks for fire safety, and shall require a recreation and open space area of 1,500 net square feet per acre of tiny house village. Additional development standards are required for movable tiny houses in a tiny house village, which are in line with existing requirements of the accessory dwelling unit ordinance. The additional requirements include skirting for the undercarriage to hide wheels, axles, tongue, and hitch, a foundation that meets state requirements for manufactured housing or an alternative anchored design that is certified by a licensed engineer, alternative paving requirements for movable tiny house parking, and mechanical equipment is not allowed on movable tiny house roofs. Additional design standards for movable tiny houses include having non-reflective siding material, except for windows. Windows shall be at least double pane and include exterior trim. Roofs must have a minimum of 1 to 12 pitch for more than 50% of the roof area. The unit shall be plumbed to allow connection to water and sewer and are required to meet Title 24 electrical codes. The draft ordinance allows for dependent unit villages to be principally permitted in multifamily residential zones and in mixed-use urban zones that have connection to water and sewer. A special permit will be required for any dependent unit villages on multifamily residential or mixed-use urban zones without connection to water and sewer, and will be required to meet the Department of Environmental Health standards. Dependent unit villages will require a conditional use permit in mixed-use rural, neighborhood commercial, community commercial, highway service commercial, limited industrial, heavy industrial, unclassified with a land use designation of residential medium density or residential low density, and residential suburban and residential two-family zones at a density no greater than allowed. Alternative lodge parks will require a conditional use permit and would be allowed in residential multiple family, apartment professional, community commercial, highway service commercial, unclassified with a land use designation of residential medium density or residential low density, in mixed use rural, limited industrial, and heavy industrial zones. Dependent unit villages are subject to the same development standards for tiny house villages, but have an exception allowable under Appendix X, which is that they may have an on-site generator or renewable power source. Alternative lodge parks are required to have connection to water and sewer, 1 parking space per unit, access from a Category 4 road and Category 2 driveway, some form of identification for each unit, and 1,500 net square feet per acre of open space area per acre of alternative lodge park. An exception was made for the requirement in Appendix X, which is a minimum requirement of 50 degrees Fahrenheit for tents to be considered suitable sleeping places. And this was due to the fact that urban areas in Humboldt County do not have a minimum of 50 degrees during much of the year. Dependent unit villages and alternative lodge parks are required to have common use facilities that meet the requirements of Appendix X of the Residential Building Code. These requirements include kitchen areas, toilets, showers, and bathrooms with running water, shall be limited to the use of occupants and personnel on site. 1 toilet shall be provided for every 2 units, and 1 bathing facility for every 4 units. Lavatories with running water, bathing facilities capable of maintaining 70 degrees Fahrenheit, a kitchen area with refrigerated storage, and on-site regular maintenance. We did receive public comment on our draft ordinance. Public comments received included general concerns regarding property ownership requirements, concerns regarding affordability, and how the county will ensure the housing is affordable, the density requirement for 20 units per acre, requirement for access from a Category 4 road and Category 2 driveway, parking space requirements, and general development standard. We are currently still looking into these comments received and how we could address them with a future draft of this ordinance. This concludes my presentation, and I'm available for questions.
Do any commissioners have brief questions or clarifications? Okay. Okay, so I guess we'll do in person first. So those of you willing, wishing to speak, please make your way to the podium, and you're allowed. I'd say 3 minutes is still fine. There isn't too many people. Attendees, I'm trying to.
Hi, I'm Nezzy Wade from Affordable Homeless Housing Alternatives, and I wrote something for each of you. However, I don't have my glasses. These are not my glasses, so I can't see a thing. But this can be after I'm.
Are they on your head?
These are on my head, but these are not my glasses. I bought these to have backup store-boughts, and they're like 2, and I need like a 5. So I can't see a thing. But I can tell you what's in all of this and what my concerns are. First of all, this is great that we're having something finally come before the county as an ordinance that can actually maybe create some alternatives that are viable. A big concern I have about reading the ordinance is there is nothing in there at all addressing really low income or unhoused population. It's not in there anywhere. There's nothing that addresses that. And some of the requirements that are in the regulations seem to me to be too restrictive and then way excessive, and something like a parking place for every person. A lot of this doesn't make sense to me. There's other stuff about keeping the bathing facilities at 70 degrees and now having some variance that you can have tents at less than 50 degrees is a really good thing. And I applaud the planning department and the county for moving us in the direction of having finally maybe something we can work with. But it brings up a whole lot of questions that I have, especially the part about the Shelter Crisis Act. We have a shelter crisis, and it says in the ordinance that that we'll be using that. Also, emergency housing. There are things that are not consistent in this document with things that would have been previously made important, like land ownership, which was one of the concerns. Who owns the land? Who can participate? Is the county? Does it have to be owned by the county, the city and the county? These things are left undetermined, and I don't think this is the place to hammer out all the fine details, but I do think it's really important to express the importance of the big picture, and what we're trying to do is to create opportunities where people can have a place to live and thrive and participate in developing it with community members and people. We have contractors who would love to help build houses, who would love to help people do this, would love to help organizations do this, and they've been with us all along. But the affordability is a huge issue.
30 seconds.
When it gets to being able to think about having a project without the active engagement of the county facilitating collaboration and coming up with some incentives like grants and other things that would make it possible. So thank you very much. I keep working hard. I don't think we're there yet, but we are getting there.
Thank you. Next speaker, please.
All right. Good evening, Commission, and through the chair, staff. My name is Praj White, and I have a couple comments I wanted to read into the record. So try to fit it into 3 minutes here. I think that allowing for tiny home villages is much needed in Humboldt County to add to Humboldt County's affordable housing stock. It's my understanding that a tiny home village is described would become an HCD-regulated special occupancy park similar to RV parks, mobile home parks, and campgrounds. My experience with these types of projects is that HCD serves as the building official and requires approval by local planning, public works, Department of Environmental Health, and the state fire marshal prior to HCD processing, grading, and building permits to construct. I suggest that the development of the ordinance be consistent with HCD requirements. I have a general list of general observations from my review of the draft ordinance for the tiny house villages. I have no comments on the emergency portion of the ordinance. I believe that you should consider allowing short-term stays to allow for diversification of housing for all landowners and renters. It appears the ordinance is excluding many communities that could benefit due to the limited zoning options. It feels inequitable to many parts of the county. Not everyone wants to live in town. The proposed zones are almost all next to the main highway and arterials and do not provide for equitable development throughout the diverse and rural county. I suggest that community planning areas and communities should have the possibility of tiny home villages. From Garberville, Redway, Bryceland, Eddersburg, Honeydew, Petrolia, Hydesville, Blocksburg, Willow Creek, Glendale, McKinleyville, Fieldbrook, and others. That being said, because each community is different, I think home villages projects should require to have a special permit or conditional use permit. Not every community wants a tiny home village in their neighborhood or on their main street. Architectural design review standards should be set by each tiny village developer and vetted through a public process of a special permit or use permit. As we have seen on many projects, it's possible through environmental process to mitigate potential issues to less than significant. Please don't make the restriction on these tiny villages so limiting that they preclude residents from owning vehicles and keeping them on site. The county is large and rural. Transit is not an option, is not a viable option for transportation countywide. Off-grid renewable power should be an option.
30 seconds.
Tiny homes can operate with a small solar system and battery backup, just like many rural homes in the county already do. Ag and TPZ should have a pathway to a tiny home village. Ag or TPZ could be the most logical location within some communities. The Climate Action Plan, General Plan, and Housing Element should consider the entire county along with this ordinance and allow for equitable housing for all communities, including the rural areas. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I put 10 copies together. I'll set up the record. Thank you very much.
Trip. This clock here wasn't working, so I was like looking there to make sure I was doing the 30-second warning, just FYI.
Yeah, I activated the button twice, dude.
Okay.
Stuck on 258.
Okay.
I promise I'll get everything together.
I thought you were messing with me. All right. Sorry.
That's okay.
Not do that in the middle of the-
Hi, my name is Darlene Spohr from Arcata House Partnership. We provide homeless services and affordable housing to the most needy in our community. I want to start by thanking staff for working on this for the last couple of years. We've been certainly having some discussions, and I am grateful that we've been part of it in the development. I think that there are some things that we can still talk about, like the number of parking spaces if we're talking about emergency housing or certain specific details. But overall, I just want to put out a big thank you for finally having this discussion. I think this is a great place to be. It's not the start, it's the middle. I think we have lots of work to still do, but thank you all for your support to get this far.
Thank you.
My name is Diana Preston, and I live at Yeehaw up in Trinidad, which has been under some discussion for many years, I understand. It's been there for nearly 40 years, and so whatever you guys come up with, the thing is, I really love living there very much, and I'd like to be able to live there without this threat of being evicted all the time, hanging over our heads. It's been there for nearly 40 years. My main point is that and in the biggest housing crunch in our history is not a place that you have to destroy something that's like been thriving and really pleasant and really a wonderful place to live for a long time. And of course, it has had its ups and downs, but it's in a really good space right now. So I hope whatever ordinances you guys come up with can be like adapted to us, and we keep improving all the time. I guess that's all I want to say.
Thank you. Next speaker, please.
Good evening, Mr. Chair, distinguished council members, county staff. My name is Vernon Price. I am a former unhoused citizen of your community, have now been housed for 7 years. As a former drug addict, I'd like to stand here today and say thank you for making these efforts to make somewhere safe, like tiny home villages and emergency shelter. For if there was a tiny home village when I was homeless, I would have become sober a lot quicker. So thank you so much for thinking this far ahead and all of the hard work to get to this point. And let's continue to work together. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Is there anybody else in the room that would like to speak?
I'll speak. And I agree with everybody before me, and thank you all for bringing us here and bringing yourselves together to support our future. I think this truly is our future, and giving certain people a chance of not falling into homelessness. This is a solution that Humboldt County can apply and apply successfully with our existing industries and tradesmen. I'm a licensed contractor. I've been working on creating alternative dwellings for some time now. Affordability is a challenge. It's a misnomer. Construction is not affordable. Here we're lucky enough to have the timber and the industries and the land to support this. So seems like we're on the right track. The community here is in full support. We need housing, and we need it soon, and we need to use our local resources to create this. So thank you. And again, Isaac Lyons, I'm a general contractor, born and raised Arcata, California, went to Arcata High. I'm in it for the long run. I'm currently setting up to build such dwellings so that they could be easily deployed. The goal would be to have, at any given time, 6 to 10 units, so that when somebody's ready to build one of these things, we fast track the process and are able to deliver and deploy quickly and accordingly. So again, it's due time. I think Humboldt County should be a leader in this. We have the resources, the people, and the personnel, and the timber to do so. So we need housing. If offshore wind is coming, if all these industries are going to keep growing, how are we going to support them, and how are we going to keep our local population from becoming displaced and from becoming homeless, because it's our local population that doesn't have the economy to compete with Bay Area people coming up, the people with money. So this is supporting Humboldt County's residents, and thank you for doing that and making this available to our people here. So thank you all.
Thank you. Is there anyone else in person that would like to speak on this? So if there's anyone else, can you please start making your way to the podium to line up as well, please?
Yeah, hi, I just want to make sure that people out in the country, which is kind of what a lot of this is about, don't get left out. And there's a lot of zoning, TPC and agricultural, that, isn't multifamily, designated, but could sure house a lot of emergency housing for folks. And also I want to say, it can be, you want to not be intimidating when you're, trying to offer people that they should get permits for things, because it could be a long path, so try and be easy. And maybe at some point somebody could make a significant explanation by what they mean by California state, emergency regulations, housing regulations.
Thank you. Is anyone else, present in person, that would like to speak on this? Seeing no one making their way to the podium, I'm going to close public comment for in-person and go to those in Zoom. I see 4 people with their hands up, and I do not know who's up first, so I'm going to rely on staff.
Be in.
In. Okay, in. You're up.
Hi there, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, well, I just want to thank this group so much for introducing this legislation. I think it's a great step in the right direction. Housing is in a crunch right now, and allowing more flexible forms of housing is a fantastic move that's going to improve equity. So I've been an advocate with houseless communities for many years. I am also the founder of an intentional community that contains tiny houses among other types of housing. And finally, I've been a speaker at the Tiny House Conference 3 years running. So this is a very important issue to me. I want to say that broadly, it's amazing that this legislation has been introduced, but I do think some of the restrictions are onerous. For example, I agree with those who have said that more zoning, more types of zoning should be included, such as ag and others. I think there's, a lot of tiny house villages include a farming aspect, and so I think we're missing out on a huge part of that community life by not including other types of zoning that are outside of the city. Secondly, I think some of the restrictions around siding and double pane windows are too specific and needlessly onerous, and would basically necessitate tiny houses that are purpose-built for the county, and that makes it very difficult if someone has to have a custom-built tiny house. That takes it into a whole other price point versus just allowing, the types of dwellings that already exist that people can purchase. I think the grid tie-in for electrical, many tiny houses run great on a local solar installation. And for example, the VRF ordinance in Oakland only requires water and sewer tie-ins and says that an acceptable solar array will be sufficient. And so I would really encourage that. I think that, solar is very common in tiny houses. And finally, again, housing is so important. Thank you for workshopping this and for hearing the public comment. I think this is really, really promising, and I yield the rest of my time.
Thank you. I'm guessing call-in user 2 would be next. Please hit *6 to unmute.
Hi. First, I want to thank everybody. I think this is a very impressive document, a very impressive presentation. But what I'm calling about is this is a very important moment because people have worked very, very hard to get here. And I would ask that we bring the Humboldt County spirit to it and do what we can to make it have absolutely the best outcomes possible. And as it's written and as this workshop is set up for 3 minutes, I don't feel at all that we're getting the kind of communication that we need to do the best that we can. I'll give you an example, and I salute it. This emergency housing village, it sounds really, really hopeful. But so I went back and I looked at some of the history of Opportunity Village, which is really the model that created an impetus for these tiny homes. Because on very low amount of money, they set up a really model program. And I went back to see how did they do that. So I remember it was like 2013, so the cost is up. It's $100,000, I think, and then $100,000 worth of donations. So I went back and I came across an excerpt that I think will help us. And I would beg us to introduce another element of this process so we can get everybody together, because we don't want it to end up that it sounds good but it doesn't work. And so here's what was written. The City of Eugene decided to take a hands-on approach and actively worked with our organization to achieve our vision while meeting all applicable building codes. They interpreted the tiny homes to be temporary structures regulated under ORSC Section 107 and as sleeping units rather than dwelling units. As a result, the homes meet code requirements for structural strength, fire safety, means of egress, and ventilation, but were granted flexibility around foundation and utility requirements, which helps to keep costs to a minimum. And I think that is absolutely the key. What can we do that we look through to what's provided here that ensures the stability, the strength, the safety of the units, but at the same time explores what can we do to make them flexible so that they're affordable? Because just one of the things about one parking, per unit, and other elements, I don't know the cost, but we should get together and figure it out, because I think it's putting it out of the range of the nonprofits that could do a beautiful, wonderful, loving job. And I think we owe it to ourselves. I'm saying it as strongly as I can. I'm begging you, please enter another element of this so we can get together and make this really work to the extent, to the optimum possibilities that it can. And I'm disappointed that it's only 3 minutes, because that's not a workshop, that's a presentation. So is my time up? Is that what I'm hearing?
10 seconds.
And so the thing I would say, yeah, please, yeah, I can't, my phone doesn't hear that. I'm not trying to go over my limit. Is my limit up?
Your limit is now up. Next caller would be Hillary Mosier. I hopefully enunciating your name correctly.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, my name is Hillary Mosier. I am a volunteer affordable housing advocate with the Golden State Manufactured Homeowners League. I want to thank all of you on the commission for doing the work that you're doing. And I'd like to say that I pretty much agree with everything that's been said before this, but I have a couple of suggestions. One is to really take a look at other communities in the state of California that already have ordinances to see how they're working for them and maybe that they've been tweaked. And those communities include Santa Cruz County, they include San Luis Obispo, someone else said Oakland, they include Fresno County. I also suggest that you look into composting toilets as opposed to hooking into plumbing because of the cost. I also suggest that Housing Forward Humboldt be utilized as a resource for funding, and that the county look at other grant opportunities that are available. I know the other communities that I talked about have been able to get grants for that. As far as YEHA goes right now, I suggest looking at the owner-initiated rehabilitation and preservation for existing housing, keeping properties affordable. The county already has a program that I believe can help them get at least some of their structures up to code. And that's basically what I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you. Last caller, looks ending in 8632. Please hit *6 to unmute.
Hello, this is Heather Kornberg. I'm from Garberville area. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Oh, good. Hi. Thank you, Commissioners, so much for having this meeting. I just wanted to put in a couple of words following what Praj White said about Southern Humboldt. And I think that it's really important that considerations are made for our Southern Humboldt community. We have a lot of allowable areas that meet the requirements. I can think of two specifically that are more located in the urban areas. And I think more of this housing being very useful for the new hospital employees that are coming in that maybe don't have a place to live. Teachers, we need the teachers to populate our schools down here. We have brand new, it's newer now, schools at the junior high and high school. It'd be great to get teachers down here that will actually live here, because as we know, people that live in the communities support the communities that they live in. So eating here, grocery shopping here, going and buying coffee here. So people live local, they'll spend local. That being said, also because they are in urban areas, I would like to see that there is some sort of curb appeal, house planning approval that's met so that we can uplift the visualization of our communities and make it so that we have affordable and also good-looking housing so people that come in from out of the area for these jobs actually want to stay here. So please consider Southern Humboldt more. We need more people down here that work down here. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your comments. Looks like we got one more hand, ending in 6655. Please hit *6 to unmute. You have 3 minutes.
Are you able to hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Oh, great. Thank you so much. My name is Virginia. I am the legal assistant to Attorney Eugene Benson, who just passed away on Friday.
Can you
I'm here.
speak, sorry to interrupt you, can you speak a little bit louder into the mic? I'm having a hard time hearing you.
Sure. Can you hear me better now?
Much better, thank you.
Okay, awesome. I turned my speaker off. Sorry about that. We were all gathered around. Hey, I've actually got one more person here. Can I get 3 minutes for him after I speak? Is that possible?
Yes, we can allow that.
Okay, thank you so much, sir. So yeah, my name is Nicole Norris. I'm Attorney Eugene Benson's legal assistant, and this ordinance means so much to him and me and so many people in our community. Ed Denson, actually, before he died on Friday, him and we had several meetings with the county about how to make this work right, and Ed was quite a libertarian and a human rights advocate, and he really wanted the county to take legal liability and pay for the costs of these sort of villages that we so desperately need. Frankly, I think it's pretty apparent, maybe not 6 months ago, but I think it's pretty apparent now. We would all be served by affordable housing opportunities being available to the masses. Folks just can't get by on just the average wage and the housing costs and everything. So yeah. One of the last things Ed Denson and I did was work on this ordinance, and the county didn't like it because,
30 seconds.
he wanted to make the liability and the cost fall on the county. And I believe with all my heart that it doesn't matter that the county takes on all of that cost and liability, and that we can come to some sort of solution together, for Yeehaw, for this amazing community that exists here. We don't need the county to take on anything. It can be solved immediately. Ed Denson, one of the last things he texted me was a Thomas Jefferson quote, and it was the government that governs least is the best, or something like that. It was just look, we need to let it go. We have these solutions that are living examples of how it can work for the people and for the planet, and we just need to be left alone, frankly.
Can you please wrap it up and then
Thank you,
pass
sir.
time to the next person?
Absolutely, sir. Hey, I'm going to just pass you on to the next person for their 3 minutes, if that's okay.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Hello, my name is Kevin. I regret not being able to be there today. I was busy working in the garden, trying to take care of things. But I guess what I would want to say is, like, as far as like these intentional communities go, what I think they provide for people is an opportunity to thrive, not just survive. And I see a lot of like the movement in California being like just shoving people in hotels and stuff. And that really doesn't help people, doesn't teach anybody any skills. I'm a friend of these communities, and I see people coming out of them better off than they were before. And I think that's a very important thing to consider. And I also agree with like most of like what everyone said. And I guess I will leave on the note of as far as composting toilets go, like every single year there's like a news report about Eureka dumping like 150,000 to 200,000 gallons of sewage into the bays. And, you know, composting toilets, they don't do that. And I would like to end on that note. Thank you for your time. That's all. Thank you.
Thank
For
you.
your time.
Seeing no other hands up, I'm going to close public comment both on Zoom and I already closed it in person. So we'll bring it back to the commission. I believe it was Commissioner O'Neill that had multiple questions. So.
Yeah, I don't, maybe, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't see where there's any protection that these tiny home villages are going to be providing low-income housing. You know, there's nothing that would prevent an out-of-town developer to just throw up some dilapidated trailers on some property at minimal cost. There is no such thing as minimal cost, but less cost than developing, say, apartment buildings, and then charging predatory rents, which we've seen where we have out-of-town landlords who've bought some of these older motels, and there's no real good management. I'd like to see tiny house villages that are managed by nonprofits who are supportive of not charging more than 25 to 30% of someone's income. I mean, there could be, as somebody mentioned, you know, out-of-town doctors or nurses that might want to live in a more upscale tiny house village, but I don't think that's really the target here. But it could work. There's different classifications, I think, in these villages. You could have rapid rehousing, you could have safe and sober housing, you could have domestic violence housing. But this doesn't cover any of that in my mind. It just says, okay, you can put something together. You know, as far as I can tell, if you did a tiny house village, you know, 10 units, you're to comply with this ordinance, you're gonna spend several $1 million just to get to that point, to have water, sewer, parking, foundations, electricity, all of that's gonna cost millions. I mean, just to buy a pre-made tiny house is, you know, minimum $75,000 to $120,000 if it has, you know, showers and toilets and all of that. And if you look at other communities, they've gone from, in some cases, a stepped up approach where, you know, for some people just living in a very minimal, maybe 10 by 12 unit that it provides them a place to sleep without being accosted is a major improvement. And then they've gone all the way up to something that, you know, like you could build up equity in and own possibly or sell. So I think that we need to make sure that we're just not creating an ordinance that allows developers to just, you know, build some houses as cheap as they can and then turn around and charge as much as they can, and people are still not housed as they should be in the county. I think there should be some mixed use in some of these designations, because I know in some areas they've created fenced areas for temporary tent housing for some of their more vulnerable populations, like, you know, that, you know, find themselves unhoused but don't want to live in the bushes, you know, because they could be accosted, often mothers with children, other parts of our population that need more protection. And so they've created fenced areas where they can put up a tent if they need to for a very short period of time, possibly on very short notice. And that could be a small area of a tiny house village that's set up for that purpose. And I think you need to, the reason why I think like a nonprofit agency that's involved in the housing of vulnerable or low-income populations needs to manage this, because we don't want it to get, you know, out of hand. I think you need to have policies for self-management. You need to involve the residents in the management process. I think there's role models. I like that, you know, we can go and look, we don't have to invent this. We can go and look at what's already out there and see what works or what hasn't worked. And we should, you know, maybe there's an emergency, you know, stepped up approach where you say, okay, we need to get this housing right away. We don't spend 5 years writing this ordinance, but this is just a temporary to start the process. But we really want something that works for those people in our community that are low income and need housing right away. And we don't want them to have to spend 75 to 100% of their income on housing. So those are some of my thoughts. You talk about tents, and I know in some areas they use yurts, or like the type of tents they used at Camp Kim2. I don't know if that matters, if a tent is a yurt or vice versa, but I'd like to make sure that that's included in there. I also am concerned about putting a bunch of dilapidated trailers in a tiny house village and then allowing a landlord to just gouge you. And that, I've seen that even, you know, on the reservation, where it's like, okay, here's a dilapidated trailer, you're gonna pay $1,000 a month for it. And I think there should be some standards on trailers. Unless they're just temporary, like you're bringing your own trailer in and then you're leaving at a certain point. But if it's a trailer that's gonna be rented out and owned by someone else, I think that, you know, we need to have a standard that doesn't get, provide substandard housing. Let me see if I got all my stuff. I also support alternative utilities. Bringing in PG&E is very expensive and time-consuming just to get them around to doing that. So if you don't already have your utilities in place, like I said, if you're doing a 10-unit tiny house village, you're going to spend a minimum of $2 million if you have to buy the units and bring in utilities. And then if you have to buy the land, that's another, you know, $500,000. So, you know, you could easily spend $3 to $5 million building one of these tiny house villages, and that totally goes against affordable housing. So unless you're getting grants, you're not going to be able to do this and follow all of the rules that we have. I think you can do solar battery. I've seen some of these ones we talked about up in Oregon where they just have one solar panel and they have a light, you know, and something to charge their phone, but that's a big step up. And we talked about that, the Square One. It's a nonprofit up by Eugene that has several of these tiny homes. And they start out as, like I said, some of them are just a box and some of them are a little one-bedroom house or maybe with a loft. So we need to look to other areas to see what works and what doesn't work. We need to ensure that there's tenant rights and there's management policies that govern. And I'm done.
Okay, I'm gonna let the director respond to some of that, and then Commissioner West. Is there any other commissioners? And then.
If I could, thank you, Chair. I just want to say, Commissioner O'Neill, you raised issues that we agree are policy issues. Mm-hmm. And so some of the way the ordinance is structured is on a gradient similar to what you talked about. There's the emergency housing provisions, and there's the tiny home provisions. Tiny home provisions are really intended to be more of a permanent housing type, not so much for the emergency housing type. And one of the things that you get into that we struggled with is that when you put affordability provisions in there, you're actually requiring that rent to be underwritten somehow. So you're adding to the overall cost of the unit. And so we, from a policy perspective, are proposing that these would actually be more affordable units by nature, because they're less expensive to put on a piece of property. They're less expensive to service. And so that is a policy decision, though. It's the decision of the planning commission that you want to see these limited to a certain income ratio or require a certain income inclusivity. That's certainly a policy pursuit that's worth talking about.
I'd like to see, input from the community, because someone mentioned, and I agree, there is no affordable housing. And if we're trying to target people that are unhoused right now, they're unhoused primarily because they don't have the income to pay high rents. And so they don't have the credit ratings or the history that they can pass a background check to get into a normal rental. So if you make these just more of those types of units that are unattainable for them, then how are we approaching the problem that we have in this county, which is, the unhoused? And I think that needs to be built into the ordinance, even if it's a percentage of, or, why are we reducing requirements to provide what we call as affordable, which I'm saying is not affordable. If you have to spend $3 million to $3 to $3.5 million for 10 small little units, it's not affordable for anyone. So yes, they're probably going to have to be subsidized by grants. The state has some grants available, and there's federal grants that nonprofits can go after to make them more affordable. And then when you're charging rents that are reasonable, those rents are going towards utilities or garbage and, maintenance more of the village than paying back for what the initial cost was.
Understand all that. I just wanted to present the other side of that discussion.
Yeah, I get that, but I'd like to hear from those people that in the county, and they've already spoken out, but tonight I don't think we can finish this, and I think
No,
we need
this is
to,
a workshop.
Yeah, we can take more testimony from those individuals that are in that field.
So
The other thing I'd like to say real quick is that relative to old trailers, is that would, in order to qualify under this, that would be a movable tiny home. And one of the rationale, the reasons for the requirement for the siding is that is a provision that most jurisdictions use to separate between old trailers, because they're typically metal sided, they're shiny, they're glazed, and what is a more current movable tiny home, which is typically made of some other material. And so that is the rationale that's in there. So that has been thought about.
Thank you. I'm going to go to other commissioners, Commissioner West and then McFarland.
I want to dive into more of the policy discussion, but before I get there, I have several questions. I can list them off, or we can kind of share airspace, and I'll come back to a couple other questions. Do you have a preference?
I don't have a preference, being as this is a workshop. I think I personally feel it'd be good for the commissioners to say everything and then go down the line, I guess, and then kind of work that way. I don't have a problem with it as a workshop, so we ain't getting anywhere tonight as far as like accepting an ordinance.
We received quite a few public comments that really, so I wanted to bring those to the forefront for the public to get some of the answers to those questions regarding the county's role in implementing this and who can own the land. Those were two questions that came up again, over and over again in the public comment. Just for clarity's sake, can you restate simply like an answer to those questions for the public?
We chose not to limit it to public property. We wanted to make it as far-reaching as possible. The incentive here is to get as much housing built as possible by anybody that really wants to do it, and recognizing that we don't want it to be just another slum, but nice housing. But we want to encourage housing to be provided.
So that anybody can, the way those regulations are written, okay. Another question I had was looking at why did staff want to require a connection to water and sewer and the electrical grid? Why, when we are looking at an apartment building, do we require an apartment building to connect into water and wastewater? We do, yeah.
Yes.
So in my brain, I was just thinking like as long as the requirements are met for water and sewage to be taken care of, why does it matter if it's a municipal system or if it's an on-site system?
We can look and see what the building code would allow in terms of alternative sources and make it consistent with that.
And then why 20 units per an acre?
I believe that came out of the general plan. Was it 3 to 20 in the general plan?
No, it says 3 or more.
3 or more, okay.
20 units is kind of in the middle of the density that's allowed for residential medium and residential low. So residential low density would allow for between 1 and 8 units, and a residential medium would allow for between 7 and 30 units. And so we kind of just went in the middle, and then we also looked at the tiny house village that's located in Arcata, and it was consistent with 20 units per acre, including parking spaces and, you know, driveways, et cetera.
And did you want me to also make my policy statements now or come back to those after questions?
I think we already had one person do policy statement, so I think it'd
We'll
only be
just
fair.
Whip through it real quick. I think I do land on, I would like to look at the building code requirements to reduce barriers as much as possible and limit when a special permit is required for, I guess, zooming out a little bit, I would love to look at permitting these types of units in places without water and sewer requirements, if feasible for health and safety. And then also, I really would like to see the 20 units per an acre removed and instead leave it to the developer and the site conditions to determine the number of units appropriate based on the other requirements that we have in place. So like if we're asking for an open space and we're asking for these other amenities to be required on site, then that will dictate the number of units to a certain extent. This is not well thought out. I might come back to this when I can say it better, but I'm going to yield the mic and let other folks talk.
Okay, so my first thought, and you kind of get to this with the difference with the lodge park and the emergency housing provisions, but maybe we need to consider some sort of tiered approach, or as you mentioned, Director Ford, on the gradient, where we have villages that are transitional housing, villages that are some sort of intermediary, which would, you know, get to O'Neill's comments about potentially capping the rent, and then the third would be those tiny villages that allow folks to establish equity, so kind of like young professionals. I know we have a lot of, for example, my physical therapist who's only here for a year, you know, give her a chance to decide maybe she could afford to stay if we had these small villages. So some sort of tiered approach, which we sort of get to with the lodge park. And then I also think we should look into a grandfathering clause. So if we have existing communities like Yeehaw or others, some sort of way to help bring them up to the standards, or we grandfather in as existing. This was pretty common. I'm originally from Los Angeles, and you know, this happens a lot with buildings. And then I agree with Commissioner West's comments about looking into alternatives for the utilities. If there are areas in rural developments where hooking up to sewer is going to make development incredibly difficult, but health and safety code can be met with on-site composting toilets or septic, then I think we should consider those.
That's everything. Commissioner Levy?
Okay, yeah, well, I'll just throw out a few comments and questions initially as well, but I look forward to having some more back and forth. Yeah, I do want to agree with a lot of what I heard here tonight, both from members of the public and also other commissioners. the letter from Colin Fisk, who's the head of the Coalition for Responsible Transportation Priorities, was really helpful. I'm sorry that he wasn't able to comment directly in the meeting, but I really do agree with a couple of the points that he made about the tiny home village ordinance. Mainly, as Commissioner West already noted, I don't really see the reason why we should cap it at 20 units per acre. I'm happy to hear the rationale for that, but it does appear that zoning for medium density residential would allow for up to 30. And so I just think that in certain instances, that might be quite appropriate. And I would presume that's as high as we could allow the density, but at the very least to have it match medium level, medium density up to 30 units where appropriate. I also agree with his point that I don't think a general requirement for parking spaces, one parking space per unit, makes sense as a hard and fast rule. I really do think that I hope that this ordinance can allow for a range of tiny house villages and emergency housing villages that frankly offer greater or lesser amenities, luxuries, parking spaces. But you know, the more we require things like that, it does tend to drive up the price. And I think for some tiny house villages, that's really desirable and appropriate, but for others, perhaps not, you know. I also agree with the folks who've come in tonight saying that I think we need to, while certainly encourage this in the more densely developed urban areas, I think we really do need to make sure that this can work for the rural parts of the county where they have the same need for low, relatively affordable housing and different zoning that may be suitable for that. And then finally, I guess I have two questions that I would love to get answered at some point. Doesn't have to be right now. One is, to what extent are we bound by certain aspects of state law as we craft this ordinance? Because I know that the California Department of Housing and Community Development has a lot of rules and regulations, and I certainly don't understand them completely. So I want to understand to what extent our ordinance must comply with state rules. There's just one instance in the staff report that I may not be recalling this exactly right, but it was something about the emergency housing provisions of state law that would generally not allow units that would require heating over 50 degrees or something like that. And what I recall the staff report saying is that we're making an exception to that requirement because we think while we do have a climate where heating could be necessary, we don't want to require that in all units under the ordinance. I may not be getting that quite right. So perhaps you can explain what it is, but I guess the larger question is, to what extent are we bound? Before we start saying what we think it should be different from how it is, I'd really like to understand better how state law governs what this ordinance has to say.
So I think the section that you're referring to is for the alternative lodge parks, and it's in regards to tents. So the Appendix X requires for tents to be considered appropriate sleeping areas that you need to have degrees of 50 degrees Fahrenheit. And so we do have the ability to change certain rules in the Appendix X, so long as we can make the finding that it will not what's the phrase? It will not, sorry, I'm drawing a blank right now.
It basically achieves the objectives of
Yeah, it doesn't cause harm to public safety and welfare.
Yeah.
So we just have to make those findings, and we can make alternative choices from that Appendix X.
Mm-hmm.
I do want to include, though, that the Appendix X provisions are only allowed during a shelter crisis. So there is a possibility that shelter crisis is no longer valid, and sites that are permitted under Appendix X would need to be removed. And that is a potential issue with that route. So we have also looked into potentially trying to go through alternative building code requirements to allow for sites like that. But that would require meeting building codes and Title 24 energy codes, which does increase costs for development. So we're really trying to create an ordinance that does lower development costs.
And thank you. If I could just ask one more sort of follow-up, which is a general level question. It's already come up a bit, but could you explain a little bit more clearly how tiny house villages and emergency housing villages relate? I mean, is it as the director said, that tiny house villages are intended to be more permanent or long-term housing, and emergency housing villages are not that?
That is correct, but as well, so when I developed this ordinance, I really thought that all of these villages would be allowed as permanent use, and then alternative lodge parks would be allowed as temporary or permanent. So I'm sorry, if you can repeat that question again.
Well, I'm just trying to understand a little bit more clearly where the line is, or the relationship between tiny house villages, emergency housing villages, alternative lodge parks.
Okay, right.
Yeah.
So a tiny house village, the tiny houses within the village would be required to have a kitchen and a bathroom within the facility. An emergency housing village for the dependent unit villages would allow for common use facilities, and that is allowable under Appendix X during a shelter crisis. So we are looking at other avenues for potentially allowing for these like detached bedroom style units without a kitchen and a bathroom. But the building code requirements for those units would be increased.
Okay, thanks.
Is that everything, Commissioner?
Sure, for now.
Okay, Commissioner West.
I have a couple more follow-up questions. Can we talk a little bit about composting toilets? Are those allowed in the county under building code?
They are currently allowed, and so this is not something regulated by planning and building. Okay, so I don't want to pass the buck or anything, but we're probably not the best people to try to explain this all the time.
Okay.
But it's my understanding that you can use a composting toilet in a situation where you can demonstrate that if the composting toilet, for whatever reason, can't be managed properly, installed properly, function properly, that you also have the ability to put in a conventional septic system. You don't have to put it in. You just have to demonstrate through the testing that's required that one can be installed and function adequately.
Okay. Then I am interested in trying to include composting toilets as an option with these tiny homes. Another question I had was under the DUV and ALP, I noticed that there's the toilets and showers are limited to the use of the occupants and staff. And I was curious why you wrote that into the code instead of letting the site manager use their discretion.
That requirement was taken directly from Appendix X, so that could be altered if we make the findings.
Okay. I personally would be interested in letting the site manager use discretion on who use the toilets and showers on their site. And then the last thing was that I noticed really wanted to echo what Commissioner Levy stated. I agreed with everything he said, and I wanted to dig a little bit more into parking spaces. I don't necessarily think requiring one parking space per dwelling unit is necessary for any of the different models, but particularly for the DUV and ALP sites where these are community members who are struggling and are already living on the streets and are at income levels that they're like potentially unlikely to have a car. So it seems like an extra barrier for a site developer to require a car in that scenario specifically.
Thank you.
I want to.
Okay, go ahead.
Speaking of cars, I live in McKinleyville, and we used to commute and leave from the parking lot by can't even think of the name of it now, the closed down department store. And the whole parking lot is full of people who are living in cars. And I don't know if any provision is going to be made for temporary people that, you know, I felt sorry for them. They're waiting for stores to open up so they can use the restroom and shower. So is that something that could be accommodated on a temporary basis so that people might be able to have access to a shower and a toilet in their car while they're waiting to get into a tiny home? And there's a large number of people that are doing that in this county.
I believe we could add that into the alternative lodge park model, so long as we make the findings.
Is that
And-
everything, Commissioner O'Neill?
Just while we're talking about the parking, I don't want to see all parking removed. I understand, you know, the comments from Commissioner West, but I'd like to see some for exactly what O'Neill stated. You know, we do have community members who the transitional housing might be a step up from their car, but we wouldn't want to force them to sell that vehicle. So some sort of happy medium that we could sort out, I think would be ideal.
So this is the fun part about being chairs. You hear everyone talk, and then lots of your thoughts might have gotten said already. But I just want to piggyback. I heard comments. I didn't ex parte beforehand because somebody saying, don't forget about rural is not really swaying me one way or another, you know, talking to people along the road. But I did hear comments today. I heard them within the community is, you know, the ability for this ordinance to be utilized in the more rural areas. People, what I'm hearing, you know, aren't feeling that it's going to touch in on that. In regards also to resource lands, you know, if there's a farm and someone wants to, you know, tiny village, that way affordable housing for employees, so that way they actually have money to work. Even managing a forest, tiny house village, managing the forest, maintaining, you know, those are things I'd like to think about. Other thing is renewable energy. I'm like, we're in California and I'm not seeing anything in there is like, hey, we aren't hooked to the grid, but we produce all of our own energy, so is that really relevant? And when I was reading through the ordinance, I didn't find anything really swaying one way or the other. And then I did hear some comments today, and curb appeal was something I did hear people, so design standards would be nice to have. I would support that because, you know, if you're going to put it, you wouldn't just want someone to be able to construct one of these without any architectural thought or consistency with the community. That's where I think the special permits are good in some areas. And parking, I hear everyone saying, I did read the letter. Me personally, I like that we do have some parking requirements. Maybe one per unit isn't something that makes it financially viable for the DUV and ALP. Was that the acronyms you used, Commissioner West? So I understand that it'd be good to dive in on that, but also the same thing is, you know, I'd like people to be able to park their cars and not have to sell them. And so let's think about that. And other than that, I was going to ask staff, are we wanting some sort of direction from commissioners, or kind of just take comment and come back with what you believe you heard?
I think at this point, we've heard the comments. We can come back where there wasn't many conflicting comments. There were some that were very close. And we'll try to come back with alternative language and additions for your consideration. And really the question for you is, would you like to do this again as a workshop or as a hearing?
So you go and then you go. So
I would suggest another workshop based on the public comments that, you know, we need more time to go through this. And just as we're talking, I'm thinking of more things now. So I think another workshop would be ideal.
Okay. Commissioner West.
I agree, and I was going to advocate for, if staff didn't already have it in mind, to maybe propose some alternatives in different sections. I found that to be a really helpful tool for us in the past for discussion. So thank you for doing it in the past. Can I make one more comment, or are we?
Yeah.
And I just wanted to throw my 2 cents in on the curb appeal and design standard things, just to be clear that I have some real hesitations around design standards for curb appeal because I really would like to remove as many barriers as possible and reduce costs as much as possible, particularly when it comes to DUV and ALP housing. So I will be advocating for reduced standards in that realm in the future.
Okay, respect that.
Just sort of to respond to that, I think that gets back to my original comment about this sort of tiered approach. So maybe there are stricter curb appeal design standards for this, I don't know what we'd call it, but these small villages where people can establish equity, and then, transitional housing would be different to accommodate your concern. And one last comment is maybe we need to consider something in the transitional housing stipulating the services that are available beyond sanitary services. So this is, job placement, access to counseling, availability of transportation, things like that.
If I may, yeah, just a real quick one about the sort of follow-up on this. I mean, I agree that I think another workshop would be appropriate, but I wonder if some other even less formal meetings in the community to kind of explain the draft and get input in a setting that might be a little bit more flexible, would not limit people to 3-minute comments, but a little bit more like what was done for the short-term rental ordinance at a number of venues. I understand you guys have limited capacity for things like that, but it's pretty clear there's a fair amount of interest in this already, in this workshop, and perhaps that's already been done in some places, but I don't think I saw any reference to that in the staff report. And I don't want to omit saying that I think you guys have done a really great job. You have done a great job, Megan. I think this is a really strong draft, and we can continue to improve it, but it's a good start.
Do we have to be done by June? September? If you would like us to go back out and have meetings with the community, we can do that. But we would not be coming back to you then, I mean.
Mm-hmm. Right. Then you'd bring it back as a public hearing.
Yeah.
Maybe it's possible, I don't know if it would qualify, but we could have a tiny house conference, and maybe some of the local nonprofits would be interested in hosting something like that, bringing in some speakers. I went to one that was in Arcata that had a speaker that, tells you what's going on in other areas, and, we could kind of get more information so that when we finish this, and we could also include it as maybe the public coming in and participating or, speaking up so that, we're kind of a little more entrenched in what's going on out there. And that's up to the community. I mean, some of them may have the resources to do that, or the county may not, I don't know.
So, question directly to staff. If it comes back as another workshop, can we actually make decisions for alternatives in that workshop?
No, it's really discussion at that point. You're not really giving direction.
That's what I thought. So I personally feel that it would be better to come back as a draft ordinance where we clearly say we're going to look at alternatives, not under a workshop, but clearly say we're going to look at alternatives, not going, publish that we're not going to accept the ordinance at that point in time. But if we're trying to constructively get through something, I wouldn't like driving up here for an hour and 10 minutes to do a workshop to technically not be allowed to make decision-making process and then come back again. That's just my thoughts.
In light of that, I would offer an option rather than another workshop that staff will reach out to particularly the people who spoke here tonight, sit down, meet with them, more fully vet some of the comments there, give people more than 3 minutes to speak, and then come back with not only alternatives in an ordinance form that you have articulated here, but bring back the things that we hear during that meeting.
To clarify, would that be just follow up with people that spoke tonight, or that's a public workshop for those who couldn't attend?
We would make it more widely available, but particularly focusing on the people who spoke tonight.
Commissioner West?
How do you propose making that more widely available to the public?
We normally would send out an email to people we know are involved with in providing housing and then do a press release.
Okay. I also just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge, I really noticed this time, and I don't know if you do it every time, this is the first time I've noticed, but I really appreciated, I saw like Facebook ads that were boosted for this. I saw social media, I saw the press coverage, and I really appreciated how much outreach that you guys did around this leading up to it. I also, I understand that you guys are working on a deadline, but we also heard some comments that the substantive material would be helpful to come out sooner. So I'm glad that we're continuing this conversation so that folks can have time to read to and respond to things. Yeah, so thank you.
So to have it come back in a non-workshop form, do we need to take any action or? Okay. So.
I think what the director proposed makes sense.
It makes
Seems like a
total
good-
sense. So with that, we're gonna go on a 10-minute recess because we're done with this agenda item.
Okay.
Call us back to order, and I'm gonna move us to public workshop on draft commercial residential's ordinance.
Good evening, commissioners and members of the public. My name is Rianne Megan, and I will be providing an overview of the commercial residential draft ordinance for this workshop. Oh. Oh, how did I present?
Stop sharing. Now, go into the screen share again and find the other one. There'll be two PowerPoints in there. One of them is the display version, and it does that to you.
Sorry about that. Thank you for bearing with us. So good evening, commissioners and members of the public. My name is Rianne Megan, and I have prepared a presentation to provide an overview of the commercial residential draft ordinance for this workshop. So the commercial residential ordinance, we are proposing a new type of development which will allow for dwellings or the combination of dwellings and commercial uses. This is in response to SB 6, the Senate Bill 6 Middle Class Housing Act, which became effective January 1st of 2023. It deems a housing development project an allowable use within a zone where office, retail, or parking is a principally permitted use. We are proposing to amend the zoning code to allow for commercial residential in neighborhood commercial, communities commercial, industrial commercial, highway service commercial, and business park. This is the inland of the ordinance. So the SB 6 eligibility criteria. The first requirement is that it must be within a project site or a location where the zone is office, retail, or parking is principally permitted per our zoning, community commercial, neighborhood commercial, industrial commercial, highway service commercial, business park, light limited industrial, and heavy industrial would all apply. The proposed ordinance aims to just have neighborhood, community, industrial, commercial, highway service commercial, and business park. We are choosing to not include limited industrial and heavy industrial to preserve the county's stock of industrial zone lands. The second requirement is that the project must be constructed by a skilled and trained workforce paid the prevailing wage. We are recommending that this requirement, removing this requirement to allow more flexibility in the building process. SB 6 requires that the project site must be 20 acres or less. Staff recommends removing this requirement because most, if not all, eligible zone parcels already meet this requirement, and we don't need to restrict just to 20 acres or less if there is that one parcel that happens to be more. SB 6 requires a density of at least 10 units per acre. This is to accommodate housing for lower income households per the state code. We are proposing to keep the minimum of 10 dwelling units per acre and proposing a maximum of 16 dwelling units per acre to be consistent with the mixed use land use designation in the general plan. However, we would like to discuss that with the commission tonight. SB 6 requires that the project cannot be located on a site or adjoining any site where more than 1/3 of the square footage is dedicated to industrial use. Staff is recommending that we keep this requirement to preserve the county's inventory of industrial lands and reduce conflicts between industrial processes and residential uses. SB 6 requires that the project must provide notice to commercial tenants and relocation assistance to certain qualifying independently owned commercial tenants. We are proposing to amend that a little and keep it as conversion of existing commercial space into residential space cannot result in the eviction of any businesses, so existing businesses. So we won't lose any operating businesses. No one would be forced out per this. The last main eligibility criteria outlined in SB 6 is going to be that the project is located on a legal parcel wholly within an urban cluster. We are keeping the requirement that it must be located on a legal parcel. That is very consistent with a lot of our planning permits and building permits to be on a legal parcel. However, we are proposing to remove the urban cluster requirement. This is to allow more communities to participate. If we keep the urban cluster requirement, it's mainly from McKinleyville to Scotia, and that's about it. And I do have maps on the following slides. So this is SB 6 eligibility. This is a layer within our GIS system right now. It is the criteria for this was zoning that met the SB 6 eligibility and urban cluster. There is some coastal parcels that are highlighted in green in this as well. That would be included in a different in the coastal version of the ordinance. However, this just gives you an idea of what someone or where someone could do SB6 currently. So McKinleyville, Samoa, that's mainly going to be coastal, so not in the inland draft, but Myrtletown, Cut-In, Fields Landing, Humboldt Hill, Fortuna and Hydesville, and Scotia. Scotia is very bright due to it being kind of one parcel right now, so that's why all of it is highlighted. Scotia has its own things, but under the current zoning, they are allowed to do SB6. So if we remove the urban cluster requirement, these communities would be eligible for commercial residential as well, so they would be able to either just have dwellings or the combination of dwellings and commercial uses per eligible zoning. So this includes communities like Willow Creek, Oric, Redcrest, Weot, Myers Flat, Miranda, Phillipsville, Redway, Garberville, and then parts of Inland Shelter Cove. This is the coastal that will be addressed in the coastal version of the ordinance. However, we did just want to show that these would also be possible sites. So this would be in addition to what was shown in green on the SB6 eligibility. So McKinleyville, Eureka, Scotia, Fortuna area, plus these other communities would all be eligible for this proposed use. With parking, we are proposing that an administrative permit could allow developers to reduce the parking for up to 50% for residential use. An administrative permit would be a more expedited process than the current restrictions of a special permit in order to provide parking exceptions. They would have to provide some justifications such as customer traffic with proposed commercial uses, it being located within 1/2 mile of a transit stop, surrounding land use, peak parking demand, things of that nature would need to be provided with the application of the administrative permit. We are also proposing that there are exceptions to this parking requirement if they commit to having entirely affordable housing. And it does need to be within 1/2 mile walking distance of public transit. So that would be just another incentive to really infill certain areas of the county. So with density, the minimum of 10 dwelling units an acre is from SB6, but also a different part of the state code. This is to accommodate for lower income households. We are proposing a maximum of 16 dwelling units per acre to be consistent with the mixed use general plan land use designation. However, that is a question that we'd like to ask the commission. Do we want to have a minimum? Do we want to have a maximum when it comes to density? Or should we just allow any units that we could get if someone wanted to do, you know, something such as a 1 unit behind their shop or something? We are also proposing a density bonus. So if we do keep the maximum of 16 dwelling units an acre, someone can go over that with affordability provisions. So that's another way to incentivize further affordability requirements. So this is a zoning table to show what is currently allowed and principally permitted in the targeted zonings. So currently in most, if not all of these zonings, some residential is allowed, principally permitted. Business Park is the only one that doesn't allow for caretakers residence and residential above ground floor commercial. So we are proposing to add commercial residential to all of these zonings, and for Business Park, we are adding the within housing opportunity zones portion to be consistent with the rest of the related zonings. And then we did receive some public comment that had some concerns about keeping the urban cluster requirement to make sure that it stays as infill. They would like to remove the density maximum and incentivize prevailing wages. And that concludes my presentation.
Thank you for that. Do any commissioners have any clarifying questions before we take public comment? Okay. I don't see anyone in person for public comment, so I'm going to open public comment and close it for in person and go to Zoom. There's 3 attendees. I don't see anyone with their hand up, so if anyone would like to speak on this, please raise your hand by hitting *9. Seeing nobody raising their hand, I'm going to close public comment for Zoom as well. Wait 1 second, Frank Richards. Right, so I'm going to allow public comment. Frank Richards, please hit *6. If any of the other 2 attendees want to speak, please hit *9.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. 3 minutes.
Yeah, my name is Frank Richards, and I'm a Hoopa tribal member in Hoopa, and I run a nonprofit, Building Lives by Building Structure, and it's a carpenter training program. I recently have an MOU with the Carpenters Union to create first period apprentice carpenters. In June, they'll have a possibility of going to work on the Cal Poly engineering building, but the tiny home is something that we're interested in building affordable housing here in Hoopa. I have a lease for a portion of the modular where we're building small homes and tiny homes.
I'm sorry to cut you off, but we're talking about commercial residential ordinance. We already spoke on the tiny homes earlier, so if your comments are about tiny homes, I'm sorry, we can't take them at this time.
Oh, okay. I just got one more comment about the prevailing wage that really puts the project way out of, affordability.
Okay.
Yep.
No, I know the prevailing wage was on this topic. I understand that. The next time we meet about tiny homes, it will be published and there'll be advertisements by the county. Does anybody else want to speak about the commercial residential ordinance? Seeing no hands go up, I'm going to close public comment and bring it back to the commission. Commissioner O'Neill?
I support the removal of the prevailing wage because that, or any reference to that, that would increase the cost and limit the number of contractors that could or be willing to work on these projects. I'm not really understanding the maximum 16 unit per acre in this regard because a lot of commercial properties are not located on a whole acre, and in order to make it economically feasible for a landlord, the more units, the better. So 16 is not maybe even a break even. So maybe that just needs to be explained to me more. I like some of the exceptions on the parking. I think that some of those could be built into the previous ordinance that we just talked about because it seems like there's more thought put into it, like especially when you're half a mile away from existing transit. I think that we should be consistent because I've seen where we've approved apartment buildings that have less than 1 per unit, and now we're giving some great options here, and maybe we should put some of those in the previous ordinance. Those are some of the things I caught. Other than that, it sounds like you put in a lot of thought to this and have done a good job. I just found my house on your map and like, what are you building behind my house? Okay.
I also support removal of the prevailing wage. I would like a little more info on the density. I think kind of what we talked about in the last agenda item about maybe letting the developer determine what was suitable as long as they meet health and safety codes. And then for the parking, I understand incentivizing reducing the parking, but I do think that needs to be really considered because that just puts the pressure on the surrounding streets, and puts the pressure on the county or the city to have this additional parking. So I think there is value in requiring some level of parking.
Thank you. Commissioner Levy?
Let's see, I really appreciate the way you went through that, the staff report and did sort of the side-by-side between what SB 6 requires and what our ordinance has. So that's my first question, is sort of like with the last one, I'm unclear. It says the eligibility requirements for SB 6 are, and then we list a bunch of requirements. But our ordinance is not meeting all of those requirements, so are they not really required?
So currently, SB 6 is in effect. If someone wanted to come in and use SB 6 and develop commercial properties with residential uses, they would have to meet all of those standards.
By default, it would follow,
Yes.
it would have to meet those standards.
What we're proposing is allowing it with fewer standards.
Yeah, okay. And that is allowed under the state
Yes,
law?
yes,
Okay,
it
good.
is.
I mean, I figured you wouldn't propose it if it wasn't, but I just wanted to understand how. Okay, but given that, I just will echo a couple things that have already been said. While, you know, I wish we could require prevailing wage and have that still result in a lot of housing being built, I think your recommendation to not include that requirement makes sense. I, too, was wanting to drill down a little bit more into the density requirement, maxing at 16 per acre. I think there's a case to be made that there are sites where it would be appropriate to allow for a higher density. Also interested, though, in I hadn't thought about the minimum number of units maybe being relaxed, because you suggested that if you relax the minimum, you might allow for a couple of units to be put in a commercially zoned property, and that might also make sense. And I think, as we all understand, we're trying to get out of the way and make this as available and affordable to create more housing as possible. And then I just had one other question, if I can quickly find my note. And I guess I also question but I would welcome your explanation of why we are not going to allow any conversion of existing residential spaces if that results in the eviction of any business. I mean, I'm not saying we shouldn't try to work around that, but it seems to me that in places where it's, I guess what I feel is that we have more of a crisis in terms of available housing than we do for available commercial spaces. And if it does involve displacing a few existing businesses to create more housing, that might be a trade-off that's worth it, in my opinion. So.
I guess my immediate thought on that is, if it's an existing business in an established, with an established lease that's maybe at a lower rate, evicting them and causing them to go into a new lease on some new commercial building may skyrocket their costs and put them out of business. So, but we couldn't mandate that their lease amount carries over. So I'm hesitant to, I support everything else you said, including the minimum standard, definitely get rid of that, but that last part, I'm not convinced on.
Well, sure, and I just want to say, and you don't have to agree with me, but at the very least, I think we would be required, if we change that, to do what SB 6 does require, which is that we would provide, what is the, I can't think, but sort of assistance for relocation. Yeah, exactly.
There's a federal, if you're using federal funds, maybe state funds, you have to pay relocation to businesses, and it adds a big cost to the project, and sometimes that you're looking for a different site so that you don't have to pay for it. But, people need jobs, so we don't want to totally get rid of all of our businesses, and then people can't find a job because now they got a house, but they can't afford the house because they don't have a job, So I think there needs to be a balance. There's like plenty of places where, you could infuse a few homes here and there upstairs of the business, or convert it, but I don't think we should displace businesses.
Commissioner West?
Thank you for the comparison table. I also wanted to echo the presentation was really easy to follow. I really appreciated how you laid it out. I agree with what folks have been saying on removing the maximum. I did have a question for staff. if you could jump into the minds of lawmakers and help us understand why the law has a minimum to begin with.
I think based upon what Ms. Mann said, is that probably had to do with wanting to encourage more affordable housing, so that having some number of units put in rather than just a single unit on a lot, really requiring it to be multiple units to increase the number of units available. But in our context, I think that one of the things that we would want to ask you to think about in that is that's one side of it. The other side of it is that what if you have a single non-conforming residence on a piece of property? Do we want to allow them to allow maybe a second unit or even 2 more units? And it may still be below the 10 units per acre density at that level, but is that something that we would want to encourage? And that's part of the trade-off here, is that, you know, sometimes you can really go after a level of a number of units and affordability and cut off some other avenues. And maybe in Humboldt County context, it's worth pursuing that lower number of units in order to achieve that.
Thank you for explaining that. I'm a little bit of two minds on that one, so I think I'm eager to hear us unwind that one a little bit more. And I just also wanted to speak to the parking requirements. I support how it's written as is. I like that you can reduce your parking requirement when you meet certain thresholds with an administrative permit. I like that there are some checks there. And then if you are really doing infill housing and you're within a transit stop, like, you can really cut your parking down. And so I support parking as it is.
Everyone spoke? Okay. I'm gonna just throw in, I support removing the prevailing wage. And I support not being able to displace a business, because jobs bring people for and then housing, and then like it's kind of this weird conundrum where I would really discourage trying to put any business out of business in the economy that we're in our county, not just our county, nationwide. So I'd really, really want to be careful with that. I have an open mind as far as the dwelling units, the number. I could see some really big opportunities for lowering that down to just a couple units or something like that. And the 16 cap, I would like to dive into that before removing it. I'd like, just a little bit more explanation and understanding. But I'm not like, hey, this has to be at 16. Anyone else have anything they want to say? Commissioner Levy?
Well, yeah, thank you. You sort of opened the door to, because even though I did say I'm open to the arguments for raising the density limit from 16 per acre, I also wanted to sort of acknowledge that you did say something in your presentation about how, as structured, there would be a density bonus, or a density bonus would be allowed where affordability standards are met. And so I didn't want to sort of gloss over that. And then maybe could you explain just a little bit more how that would work? What would be the affordability standards that would have to be met for that?
So we do have a separate provision in the ordinance that exists already about density bonus standards. And one of the things you can do is you can get relief from certain requirements within the ordinance in order to achieve affordability. Part of that is the limitation on the number of units. It also, parking, other requirements can be waived or reduced in order to achieve a certain amount of affordability. So one strategy, and the strategy we're presenting, is that the 16 dwelling units per acre becomes a threshold. If you come in and do 16 or less, then your market rate. But if you want to do more than that, then you've got to do some things to, including provide some of them being affordable. And that then requires you to enter into a long-term contract to ensure affordability. And let me just say, I don't want to give a whole dissertation on affordable housing and RENA numbers, but our low and very low, we get different standards based upon whether or not we have a contract or not. And so by triggering a density bonus program, they would enter into a contract to keep those as affordable. The state registers that. So it's something that it strategically helps us a little bit achieve some things we're not getting a lot of right now.
Thank you. That's very clarifying.
I have something.
Commissioner O'Neill?
I like that, and I think that that could be a part of the previous ordinance too, that, you know, yes, you're gonna meet all these code requirements, but if you're providing affordable housing, and often they put a lien on your property for 25 years, the state does, when you're doing low-income housing, that you get to maybe have the composting toilets and the solar, you know, that doesn't have to be hooked up to the PG&E and all that, so that you're just not letting a contractor come in or a landlord. And I know we're not supposed to be talking about the previous ordinance, but I like things that were written in here that could be infused into the previous ordinance. And when I first read this, I was thinking that we were talking about commercial buildings that already existed, but we're not. We're talking about commercial properties also, right?
So to clarify what you said, Director Ford, it would benefit the county more to leave the cap at 16, because then developers that want to go over that enroll in this density bonus program, as opposed to removing the cap and letting the market decide, that would have less benefit to the county.
We would have no ability to require degrees of affordability at that level. Well, let me clarify, unless we wrote that into the ordinance. I mean, another option is you could say, yeah, we'll allow up to X number of units, but a certain percentage have to be affordable. But using the existing density bonus provisions allows a developer to do their business plan and choose what path they want to go on. It doesn't predispose them to one path.
They could have a percentage of them be low income, not, they wouldn't have to have 100%.
Correct.
So for me, after hearing the director, I'm no longer interested in removing that 16-acre cap, because if we're trying to encourage people to put in some affordable housing, that kind of takes away the encouragement, is kind of the way I heard it. So I would like to keep that 16 number. I'm just one of 7, one of 5 today, though.
Yes, generally in agreement, but one more clarifying question. So once the ordinance is adopted, you know, it can't be changed, but the language of the density bonus, is that separate and it can evolve with time? Okay.
To be clear, though, the density bonus is an ordinance, but it has flexibility within it.
Yes, if I may just agree with what Chair Mulder said, I actually, now that I understand it a little bit better, I think the scheme that you're proposing makes a lot of sense, and I don't want to remove that incentive for greater affordability in exchange for greater density. And I will also just second what Commissioner O'Neill said, which is that although we're not talking about the tiny homes ordinance anymore, I do think there's a few places, she identified 1 or 2, where I think maybe some of the strategies that are being employed here could be employed also in the tiny village ordinance to good effect.
Let's just be a little careful how much we go into that, though, because there is still someone following that I did cut off public comment, so I don't want to be unfair. Do we need anything on this one? Like, as far as direction, I would guess that it would come back as a draft ordinance in a hearing, not another workshop.
That is correct.
Okay.
Not another workshop.
Correct.
Right, okay. I guess, could I just ask one more question? And I want to make sure that we did respond to each of the points that you said you were sort of specifically inviting feedback. So if we missed any, maybe you can remind us. One other one that I'm just maybe wanting to understand a little bit better is the the limitation on this applying to certain industrial zoning areas, I don't, off the top of my head, you know, I don't know how many that would apply to or exactly which ones it would apply to, but I'm wondering if you can explain a little bit better, is that a zoning that you think is in shorter supply than the other sorts of commercial zoning and could therefore cause real conflicts if we allowed it to happen there?
So we didn't do a specific inventory, but when we were thinking about the conflicts with industrial uses and residential uses, that's where we came to this idea. Many places don't allow the types of uses, it was office use, et cetera, in those industrial uses, but we do. So what's interesting about this is that right now, the state law allows that under SB 6. So if they met all the provisions of the state law, they'd still be allowed to build residential in those areas. So we're not eliminating that allowance for the industrial. They just have to follow all those provisions of the state law.
Okay, that makes more sense. It's a slightly more restrictive pathway, but they still have a pathway.
Exactly. So we were just looking at it like, well, industrial's a little bit different. We want to make sure that we still have some industrial land. There's the noise and the odors and the different things that can be a conflict with residential. So that's the way we looked at it, but we're open to hearing what you have to say about it as well.
Just thinking, because we have so many low-lying areas, can you explain, I'm thinking like commercial industrial areas in like Arcata, can you explain how the difference between flood insurance for commercial industrial areas that now would have residential properties on them, is there a difference? Would they still be able to get that coverage?
So we are the administrators of the floodplain for Humboldt County. So we implement the requirements of the flood insurance right now. So basically, if we were to permit a new residence or an addition to a residence, that would have to have 1 foot of freeboard above the current area subject to flooding. And if you're not familiar with the term freeboard, what that refers to is that it'd be the top of the water surface elevation, and then there would be a foot before you got to the finished floor. And so I think they could get insurance under those circumstances, providing they're complying with the requirements of FEMA from that perspective. And we implement that, we require that.
Do we have any other questions?
Getting insurance is really hard.
Oh, God.
I have insurance and I can't get insurance on an ADU that I built because nobody in California wants to insure you anymore.
Anything else? Staff?
So I just wanted to ask if you are in agreement with the concept of not just having this allowed in urban clusters, which is what is allowed in SB 6, with the additional areas that we proposed?
Yes.
Okay. I just wanted to clarify that because no one had said anything, so.
I do support that. You know, I was wondering if, sorry. Oh no, well, okay, I was just gonna say, I certainly don't want to say it has to be in the urban cluster area because it pretty clearly would exclude a lot of areas of the county where I think they could benefit from this. You know, I do wonder if perhaps in this, in the various types of incentives that are written in, if we can still, and I think maybe it is already still giving more incentives to do it in those places which are close to services and close to transit. Maybe they can get higher density or things like that. You know, I mean, there's ways in which I think we want to continue to encourage that as much as we can. But I think, there's a lot of places in the county that have, clusters of development where this could be really necessary and beneficial as well.
I agree with Commissioner Levy. I would love to see us explore how to incentivize the clustering to support potentially affordability or something else. Just I did appreciate CTRP's comment on how meaningful it is to cluster, but I do think this is a situation where there are opportunities for housing and badly needed housing outside of the clusters. So I think incentives is a good way to find compromise.
Any last words?
Just
Director?
wanted to make sure that we kind of heard a consensus about going below the 10 units per acre.
I was in agreement. Commissioner Levy,
I was in agreement.
I'm a little bit on the line, but we'll get there.
Yeah, on balance, I would support being as flexible as we can with this.
so with that, I would say we'd move on to our next agenda item. And this, we would just clarify, this would come back as a hearing, not a workshop. So I think report from planner is the next thing we have. Do you have anything, Director?
I don't have anything other than to say that perhaps you heard tonight in the testimony that Ed Denson passed away this last week. And I just want to say that he's been a kind of a vital part of a lot that the Planning and Building Department has done. And he's always been a very gracious individual, and he'll be missed. So. I just
What was
wanna
his
say
name?
that. His name's Ed Denson.
Or often known as E.D. Denson, but yeah, I just learned that yesterday, and yeah, he's been a big part of this community for as long as I've lived here, and longer than that.
Yeah, and that's why I had a hard time cutting someone off in public comment. I was not going to cut someone off in the middle of that.
His legal assistant, I think it was.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so. Yeah.
Is it appropriate for me to ask how the meeting in McKinleyville went earlier this week?
It is appropriate. I'm sorry I didn't bring that up. We had the scoping meeting for the town center project, and there weren't a lot of people that came. I think we may be coordinating a little bit with the MCMAC, the McKinleyville Municipal Advisory Committee, to try to get some more, elicit some more public feedback. But the EIR consultant was present and is moving forward with preparation of the EIR. So we're moving forward with the town center ordinance as fast as we possibly can.
Thank you. Last thing is planning commission discussion items. Anyone have anything? Nothing? All right, meeting's adjourned.
Thank you.